Have you ever sat at the same table as someone you love and realized you had absolutely nothing to say to each other? Not angry, not fighting, just empty. Like two strangers who happen to share a house, a bed, a last name. You pass the salt, you ask about the weather, you look at your phones and call it a night. If you have felt that, even once, this story is for you. Because a woman who died in the year 1582, a Spanish mystic who had never been married and spent the last decades of her life inside convent walls, somehow understood the exact mechanism by which couples fall apart. She described it with terrifying precision, centuries before any researcher had a word for it. And what she saw was not a dramatic collapse. It was not betrayal. It was not a single terrible night. It was silence. The slow, comfortable, invisible silence that takes over when couples stop sharing even the small things. Her name was Teresa of Avila, born Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda y Ahumada on the 28th of March, 1515, in the city of Avila, in the Kingdom of Castile, Spain, daughter of a converso family. Her grandfather, Juan Sanchez de Toledo, had faced the Spanish Inquisition in Toledo around 1507 for secretly practicing Judaism after publicly converting to Christianity. The consequence was a public penance, forced wearing of the yellow penitent's robes through the streets. The humiliation was deep enough that the family fled north to Avila, where they purchased a patent of lower nobility and attempted to start life over. Teresa grew up in a household already shaped by the weight of hidden things, words never spoken openly, identities kept behind closed doors. Silence was not a stranger to her childhood. She had watched her own family choose invisibility as a form of survival. She understood, from her earliest years, what it costs to conceal your interior life from the people around you. At 20 years old, in November of 1535, she entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila. This was against her father Alonso's wishes. He had hoped for a more worldly life for her. The convent she entered was not the small, stripped-down reform community she would later found. The convent of the Incarnation, in 1535, housed approximately 150 nuns and operated more like a small village than a strict cloister. Women of the upper classes brought their maids, their furniture, even small pets. Visitors came and went through the parlor with relative freedom. Teresa, by her own admission in her autobiography, thrived socially in this environment. She liked the conversation, she liked the company, and for years she used all of that social energy as a quiet substitute for the interior sharing that genuine prayer demands. For the next 20 years, her spiritual life was, by her own admission in the book of her life, dangerously shallow. She prayed when it was convenient. She socialized when she should have been praying. She maintained the outward form of religious life while the interior went dark. She described this period in her autobiography with brutal, almost clinical honesty. She said it was like being in a state of paralysis, present in the building where God was but not actually in contact with him, physically inside the convent, spiritually absent. The silence between her soul and God had not announced itself with a crash. It had crept in through the small things she stopped sharing, the small prayers she stopped meaning, the small moments of genuine attention she started skipping. And the terrible thing, she wrote, was that nobody could see it from the outside. She still looked like a nun. She still said the words. The disappearance was entirely interior. In 1562, at 47 years old, she founded the first of what would eventually become 17 Reformed Discalced Carmelite convents, starting with the convent of St. Joseph in Avila. The reform was radical. No more than 13 nuns per house, no personal property, no maids, no long parlor visits, and strict internal silence, not as punishment, but as the environment in which genuine speech between the soul and God becomes possible. She was not making life quieter. She was removing the noise that had allowed her own interior life to go dark for 2 decades without anyone, including herself, noticing. That same period, she began writing, not carefully, not with scholarly confidence. She stole time. She wrote between duties. She said in her own words, "I almost have to steal the time for writing, and that with difficulty, because it hinders me from spinning, and I am living in a poor house where there is a great deal to do." She was founding convents across Spain, negotiating with bishops and civil authorities, managing complicated relationships with the Carmelite leadership, all while producing some of the most penetrating writing about human intimacy that the 16th century or any other century has offered. She had no quiet desk. She had no uninterrupted hours. But she had paid the full price of losing genuine connection for 20 years, and she was determined to explain exactly how that happens and exactly how to stop it. If you find value in content that goes this deep into documented spiritual history and the real mechanics of love, subscribe right now. It is the best and simplest way to support this work. Leave a comment telling us what city you are hearing this from. This script draws directly from Teresa's primary writings, specifically the book of her life, completed around 1565, and the interior castle, written in 1577, both translated in their critical scholarly edition by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez for ICS Publications, Washington, D.C., published in 1985 as The Collected Works of St. Teresa of Avila. Not a summary, not a paraphrase of someone else's interpretation. The source. And, in the 20th century, the academic discipline that came closest to independently confirming what Teresa saw was relationship psychology. Now back to the story. In The Book of Her Life, chapter 8, paragraph 5, Teresa wrote the sentence that became the foundation of her entire understanding of love. She wrote, "Mental prayer is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with him who we know loves us." That sentence was written about prayer, about the soul's relationship with God. But Teresa of Avila used marriage as her central metaphor throughout her entire body of work. She called the deepest union of a soul with God a spiritual marriage. She compared the soul to a bride and God to a bridegroom, and she did not use these words lightly or decoratively. She used them because she believed the mechanics of intimate love between two people and the mechanics of the soul's deepest intimacy with God follow the same laws, which means the sentence above translates directly into every marriage and every close partnership that has ever existed. You take time, frequently, to be with the one who loves you, and when you stop, something begins to die. Not loudly, not fast, silently, slowly, like a fire that goes out because no one added wood, not because anyone wanted to end it. Teresa was not guessing when she wrote this. She had lived it. For approximately 20 years inside the convent of the Incarnation, she had maintained what she called a friendship with God, while simultaneously neglecting real contact with Him. She showed up, she performed the rituals, she was in the room, but she was not sharing. She was going through the architecture of intimacy without inhabiting it, and she described the result with a kind of honest grief. She said it was a paralysis. She said the relationship had a form, but not a living interior. She said it was possible to walk every single day past the door of genuine connection and not go through it, so long as you were busy enough with the activity around the door. The convent was never quiet enough to notice what had gone quiet. That word, quiet. That is the one. In 1986, at the University of Washington in Seattle, psychologist John Gottman and his colleague Robert Levinson began collecting data from couples in what became known as the Love Lab. They brought couples into a room, hooked them to electrodes measuring heart rate, blood flow, and sweat production, asked them to talk about their relationship, how they met, a current conflict, a positive memory. They coded the data. Then they followed the couples for 6 years. And what Gottman found was so specific and so repeatable that it became one of the most cited data sets in relationship psychology. In 1990, he set up a studio apartment near the University of Washington campus and brought in 130 newlywed couples to spend a single day there while cameras recorded every interaction. Normal day, normal activities. He was watching for something very particular, something small. He was watching for what he eventually called bids for connection. A bid for connection is any attempt, verbal or physical, large or small, to get your partner's attention, affection, or emotional response. A wife who says, "Look at that beautiful bird outside," is not talking about the bird. She is reaching toward her husband, asking him to enter her moment, to share her experience, to be present with her in a small flash of wonder. A husband who sighs deeply after arriving home from work is not just breathing. He is signaling something, reaching out, hoping to be met. These bids happen constantly in every relationship. Gottman found that over the course of a single meal, a happy couple could make as many as 100 such bids. And then he tracked what happened to those bids. When he followed up 6 years later, the pattern was unambiguous. Couples who remained married had turned toward their partner's bids, meaning responded to them with some form of acknowledgement or engagement, 86% of the time. Couples who had divorced by that point had turned toward their partner's bids only 33% of the time. The gap between 86% and 33% is the distance between a marriage and a dissolution. And it was not measured in grand arguments or dramatic betrayals. It was measured in birds seen through windows, in sighs, heard or not heard, in a sentence started and then abandoned because the other person was already looking somewhere else. Based on observing couples for just 15 minutes, Gottman reported he could predict with 94% accuracy whether they would still be together several years later. 15 minutes, one meal. A handful of moments where someone reaches and either gets met or does not. Teresa of Avila understood this in 1565. She did not have Gottman's cameras. She did not have his electrode equipment or his longitudinal studies or his spreadsheets, but she understood it completely at the level of lived experience, and she put it on paper in the plainest language she could manage. She wrote in The Interior Castle, the 7-room allegory she produced in 1577 during 6 weeks of focused writing at the convent of the Incarnation in Avila, that the union of two people who are truly together is like rain falling into a river. She wrote, "All is water, for the rain that fell from heaven cannot be divided or separated from the water of the river, or it is like what we have when a little stream enters the sea. There's no means of separating the two. But to reach that state of union, she explained, both people must have been choosing, day after day, to go deeper into the castle, rather than stay comfortable in the outer rooms. The 7 rooms are not 7 stages you progress through once and stay in. They are 7 levels of willingness to keep showing up, keep sharing, keep walking toward the other person, even when it is inconvenient, even when you're tired, even when what you have to share seems too small or too ugly or too ordinary to be worth offering. Most couples, she observed, stop walking without realizing they have stopped. They stand in one room long enough that the walls begin to feel like the whole house. They mistake familiarity for closeness. They mistake the absence of conflict for the presence of love. And the silence, which was once a comfortable room to rest in, becomes the permanent address. Dry. Still. Home. She called the earliest stage of relational drift not a fight, not a betrayal, but a kind of forgetting. In her autobiography, describing her own 2 decades of spiritual mediocrity, she said she had simply ceased to practice prayer. Not dramatically, not with a decision, just ceased. One day she was genuinely sharing, and the next day she was not, and there was no single day she could point to as the turning point, because there was no turning point. It was a gradient, an accumulation of small, chosen absences. The small words not spoken, the small question not asked, the small detail of the day that she thought about sharing but then decided was not worth mentioning because the moment was already passing and it seemed easier to let it go. That is where every silent marriage begins. Not with a lie, not with a betrayal, with a detail one person kept to themselves because it seemed too small to bother with. Gottman's research gave this drift a clinical name, the distance and isolation cascade. He described it as a predictable sequence that begins with decreasing marital happiness, moves into more frequent negative interpretations of the partner's behavior, then into deliberate avoidance of certain conversations, because experience has shown those conversations will not resolve well, and then into the expansion of that avoidance until the 2 people are communicating only in logistics, schedules, grocery lists, who picks up the children. The cascade, once started, tends to be self-reinforcing. Each avoided conversation is evidence that connection is difficult, and that evidence makes the next attempt feel less worth making. Research published in the journal Research and Practice in Couple Therapy in 2024 by Fernandez and Hernandez found that stonewalling, the behavior of withdrawing from interaction and refusing engagement during moments of relational stress, mediates directly between conflict avoidance and sexual disengagement. The silence does not stay in one room. It migrates. It colonizes every form of intimacy, one room at a time. University of Missouri researchers studying couples and emotional disconnection in 2012 found that a personality trait called alexithymia, the clinical term for difficulty identifying and articulating one's own emotions, appeared in approximately 7.5% of the men and 6.5% of the women in their sample of 155 heterosexual couples. When one partner had this trait, the other partner experienced measurable increases in loneliness and significant declines in reported marital quality. The trait is not a choice. It is not cruelty. It is simply the inability to translate interior experience into shared language. And the person across the table sits in that silence and feels, over months and years, completely alone. Teresa watched an identical process in the spiritual lives of the people she directed. She watched people who had once prayed with fire and precision drift into a mechanical performance. They showed up at chapel. They said the hours. They knelt at the right times. But she wrote in The Way of Perfection, her manual for life and community completed around 1566, that friendship requires something more demanding than presence. She wrote, "In order that love be true and the friendship endure, the wills of the friends must be in accord. 2 people who live together but no longer share what they genuinely want, genuinely fear, genuinely wonder about, are not friends in the sense Teresa meant. They are housemates performing the costume of a marriage. Every night they take the costume off and go to sleep next to a stranger, and in the morning they put it back on, and they call this a life together." She was precise about the mechanism. She warned the nuns in her communities about what she called a particular friendship, a bond based on surface warmth and the comfort of familiarity, but lacking genuine interior contact. She wrote in The Way of Perfection, Chapter 7, that such friendships are seldom directed toward helping one love more. They feel good. They look like intimacy from the outside. But they are a substitute for real sharing, which is riskier and requires the willingness to be unknown, to be confusing, to bring your actual interior life into the room, rather than the version of it that you know will be acceptable. If you value this kind of documented research-backed spiritual history, subscribe now. It really does matter. Tell us in the comments what city you are in right now. And before we get to what Teresa actually teaches couples to do, here is what the silence looks like in real data. Gottman Institute research, drawn from more than 3,000 couples across 40 years of studies, found that couples who feel emotionally disconnected do not always argue more. Sometimes they argue less because they have stopped engaging enough to generate real conflict. The average couple experiencing serious marital unhappiness waits 6 years before seeking any kind of help. 6 years of the cascade deepening. 6 years of bids ignored or missed. 6 years of small details kept to oneself. A 2024 study published in Frontiers in Psychology using ecological momentary assessment, in which 100 romantic couples in South Korea received 6 prompts per day over 3 days, tracking their real-time emotional state, found that emotional disconnection and emotional loneliness are distinct but closely linked phenomena in relationships. The correlation between them ran at 0.68 for women and 0.62 for men. The researchers concluded that perceived loss of harmony between partners is both a predictor and a mediator of relationship distress. It predicts worse outcomes, and it explains why worse outcomes happen. The silence is not just a symptom, it is the mechanism. Now, what does Teresa actually tell you to do? Because she does not leave you in the dark room. That is the thing people miss about Teresa of Avila. They think of her as the mystic of visions, of levitations recorded by eyewitnesses at the convent of St. Joseph in Avila, of the golden light that supposedly appeared around her while she prayed. These things are documented in the contemporary accounts of her sisters and confessors and are part of the historical record preserved in the archives of the Discalced Carmelite order. But Teresa herself was almost impatient with the extraordinary. At the end of the interior castle, after walking the reader through all 7 rooms, after describing spiritual betrothal and spiritual marriage, and all the deepest language of union she had at her command, she landed firmly on a single sentence. She wrote, "This is the reason for prayer, my daughters, the purpose of this spiritual marriage, the birth always of good works, good works. Not raptures, not lights, works, presents, the practical turning toward the person in front of you." She gave specific instructions. She gave them to nuns, but they apply without modification to any 2 people who have chosen each other. First, show up anyway. She was explicit in the way of perfection that progress in genuine intimacy depends more on resolute will than on experiencing consolations. This means do not wait until you feel like talking. Do not wait until the desire to connect arrives naturally. It will not arrive on its own in a relationship that has gone quiet. The will must go first. Decide that you will show up. Walk into the room. Begin the sentence even when it feels small and imperfect and unlikely to accomplish anything remarkable. The act of beginning is the whole point. Second, be sensitive to small things. She wrote in The Way of Perfection that people are often affected by very small things, and that if you are not easily affected, you must not neglect to have compassion on others. Your partner's small response, the slightly flat tone, the half answer, the sentence that trails off, these are signals from an interior life that is trying, in the only language it currently has available, to tell you something. Do not ignore them because they are ambiguous. Sit with the ambiguity. Third, when there is an argument, repair it immediately. She was unambiguous. If you should be cross with one another because of some hasty word, you must at once correct the matter and pray earnestly. Do not let an injury sit overnight. The Gottman research confirms this with data. Every hour a wound sits unaddressed, it begins to harden into a piece of the wall. By the following morning, what was a soft bruise has become part of the architecture of distance. Fourth, look for the interior life of the other person, not just the surface. Teresa wrote that if you dig into the person in front of you, you will find gold within this mine. This requires curiosity, not the performance of curiosity, not the question asked while you are already half thinking about something else, but the actual desire to know what is inside another person, what they are afraid of this week, what they are hoping for. What small thing made them laugh on Tuesday that they almost told you about but then swallowed because they were not sure you would find it interesting? That detail, the one they almost told you, that is where the connection lives. Teresa described prayer, and by extension all genuine intimacy, as taking time frequently. Not once a year at the marriage retreat, not occasionally when things get bad enough that you cannot ignore them, frequently. Because the interior life of another person changes constantly. And if you are not checking in frequently, you are relating to a version of them that is 6 months out of date. You are married to a memory of a person, rather than the person currently sitting across from you. The Gottman concept of small things often says exactly this in modern language. Not the annual vacation, not the big gestures, the 65% of relationship satisfaction that comes from turning toward, from meeting the small bid, from being present in the ordinary moment, accumulates across thousands of tiny interactions over years. A happy couple who has been married 20 years has made and met hundreds of thousands of bids for connection. That is what 20 years of love is made of, not the major milestones, the minor moments. Teresa's final years give this teaching its sharpest edge. In the autumn of 1582, she was traveling by carriage through northern Spain. She had just completed the founding of her 17th Discalced Carmelite convent, this one in Burgos, She was 67 years old. Her health had been difficult throughout her life. She had suffered a severe physical collapse in the years 1538 to 1542 at the convent of the Incarnation, so severe that her family had temporarily brought her home, thinking she was dying. She had recovered, but she was never physically robust. By 1582, she was hemorrhaging internally and in significant pain during the journey back toward Avila. She arrived at the convent of the Annunciation in Alba de Tormes in October. When she arrived, she refused to allow the community to disrupt their normal routine on her behalf. She asked for nothing special. She lay down on a simple bed and received the last sacraments. She spent her final hours speaking to the sisters gathered around her, talking in a way that eyewitnesses described as direct and quiet, without drama. She died in the early hours of the 4th of October 1582, on the night that Spain, in compliance with the papal bull Inter Gravissimus issued by Pope Gregory IX in February of that same year, was removing 10 days from the Julian calendar to align it with the Gregorian calendar. The dates, October 5th through October 14th, 1582, do not exist in Catholic countries. Teresa died on the night of October 4th in the old calendar, and the next day was already October 15th in the new one. She was registered as having died on October 15th. That is her feast day. She was canonized on the 12th of March, 1622, by Pope Gregory XV, alongside Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, and Philip Neri, in one of the largest simultaneous canonizations in the history of the Church to that date. In 1970, Pope Paul VI made her a Doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive that title. The University of Salamanca had proposed the title as early as 1617, 353 years before it was officially conferred. She waited for recognition with what might be described as the patience of someone who had learned at great cost that what matters is not what other people do with your words, but whether the words are true. Her words were true. Gottman's cameras confirmed them 400 years later. Here is what Teresa saw most clearly, and what every piece of research cited in this script confirms. Couples do not fail because of crisis. Intimacy does not die in disaster. It dies in the ordinary. It dies on a Thursday evening when someone wanted to share a small thought and decided it was not worth it. It dies in the habit of editing yourself down to only the things you're confident will be received well. It dies in the gradual substitution of logistics for conversation, of routine for presence, of comfort for contact. Teresa wrote of her own 2 decades of spiritual aridity, not as a dramatic fall, but as a fade. The relationship still had a shape. It still had a name. She still appeared every day at the correct time and said the correct words. But she wrote that she had lost the habit of genuinely sharing, and losing that habit had turned the most important relationship in her life into a beautiful, lifeless room. What restored it, she wrote, was not a vision, not an ecstasy, not a dramatic intervention. It was a moment around the year 1554 when she stopped in a corridor of the Convent of the Incarnation and stood in front of a small statue of the wounded Christ. She did not kneel. She did not say a formal prayer. She simply stopped, let herself be seen, let the silence of the moment become an actual exchange rather than another occasion to pass through without contact. She was 40 years old, 19 years inside those walls, and something that had been closed began to open. The Gottman Institute, tracking couples through the Love Lab across 40 years of research involving more than 3,000 couples, found that couples who eventually divorced had not stopped being in the same room. They had stopped turning toward. The average time from the onset of serious marital unhappiness to seeking help was 6 years. 6 years of standing in the corridor, choosing not to stop. Teresa of Avila handed the manuscript of the interior castle to her confessor in Toledo in November of 1577. She reportedly said she had written it in obedience, not because she believed it would accomplish much. She was describing something that everyone already knew and nobody seemed to be doing. The castle, the rooms, the choice to go deeper or to stay comfortable where you are. The person standing in the room beside you, making a bid, asking, even in the most indirect and fragile language available to them to be seen. In 1997, archaeologists conducting restoration work at the original Convent of the Incarnation in Avila documented the dimensions of the cloister corridor that Teresa and the community walked daily during the decades of her most intense interior work. The corridor runs approximately 14 meters in length. Its width in the original 16th century construction was less than 2 meters, narrow enough that 2 people approaching from opposite ends would have no choice but to acknowledge each other or turn sideways and look at the wall. No middle path, no way to pass without making a decision. You turn toward or you turn away. She walked that corridor every day. Some days, the records of her sisters suggest she stopped and spoke. Some days she passed in silence. Some days she was deep in thought and did not see whoever was there. And some days she saw them and chose the wall. The sisters who survived her remembered which kind of day they were having by how they felt when they reached their own cells at the end of it. The ones where she had turned toward them, where she had actually stopped and asked and listened, left them feeling as though something had been restored that they had not known was missing. The ones where she passed left a different feeling, smaller and harder to name. That is the silence she was writing about in 1577. But let us be specific about what turning toward actually looks like in practice, because it is not a concept, it is a behavior. And Teresa's instructions, cross-referenced with Gottman's data, produce a set of habits that any two people can begin immediately, in the next conversation, in the next meal, in the next evening, sitting across from each other with the option of a screen or the option of a face. Teresa said in The Way of Perfection, in a passage that scholars working with the Kavanaugh and Rodriguez translation have flagged as one of her most practically specific teachings, that friendship requires a willingness to be uncomfortable on behalf of another person. She wrote, "It is a good proof and test of our love if we can bear with such faults and not be shocked by them." She was talking about the faults of other people, their moods, their failings, their difficult days, their repetitive anxieties. The willingness to sit with someone in the version of themselves they are today, not the version you prefer, not the version they were last summer when things were easier, the version they are at 7:30 on a Wednesday when the children are done and the dishes are done and there is no performance left in either of you. That version. Are you willing to turn toward that version? Gottman's data answers this question in numbers. In couples who remain together over 6 years of tracking, the ratio of positive interactions to negative interactions held at approximately 5-1, and in the most satisfying marriages, it ran closer to 20-1. In couples who divorced, the ratio had deteriorated to less than 1-1, meaning negative interactions outnumbered or matched positive ones. But the key finding, the one that changes how you understand the number, is that the positive interactions Gottman counted were not elaborate. They were not expensive or planned. They were the turned head, the yes instead of the silence. The question asked with genuine curiosity, the willingness, in the language Teresa used 4 centuries earlier, to correct the matter at once, rather than letting it sit. She also said something that few readers of Teresa notice because it is tucked into a passage about the nature of spiritual dryness. She said that even when you do not feel love, even when the warmth has gone and the words feel wooden and the connection feels entirely absent, the act of showing up and attempting contact is itself a form of love. The will counts when the feeling has not yet arrived. She had experienced this personally. For years, she had knelt in the chapel of the Convent of the Incarnation and felt nothing, no warmth, no response. Just the hard floor and the empty air. And she went back the next day anyway, and the day after that, because she had made a commitment, and the commitment was not contingent on the feeling. This is exactly what modern relationship research has found about the function of habits in long-term relationships. Dr. John Gottman wrote in his 2022 book, The Love Prescription, co-authored with Julie Schwartz-Gottman, that the foundation of lasting connection is not romantic feeling, but what he calls the spirit of fondness and admiration. A cultivated orientation towards seeing the good in your partner that functions as a kind of cognitive habit. The couples who maintain this spirit, even through conflict, even through boredom, even through the years when the children were small and the money was tight and every conversation happened in 5-minute fragments, were the couples whose relationships survived and eventually deepened. The couples who allowed that spirit to erode, who began cataloging each other's failings and replacing generous interpretation with suspicious interpretation, lost their marriages not in a single moment, but in 10,000 moments of choosing the darker reading of an ambiguous situation. Teresa of Avila called this the problem of particular love going wrong. She described how a relationship that was once warm and genuine can sour into something possessive and resentful when one person begins to keep score of what they have given and what they have received in return. She wrote in The Way of Perfection that the return of affection is insubstantial like straw, as light as air, and easily carried away by the wind. She meant, do not build your love on the expectation of being loved back in precisely the way you expect. Love what is actually there, not the mirror image of your own need. When two people both focus primarily on whether they are receiving enough, rather than on whether they are giving with sufficient attention and care, both of them end up starving. Each waits for the other to begin, neither begins. The silence deepens, and both of them call it the other person's fault. The Gottman Institute calls this pattern negative sentiment override, the state in which one or both partners interpret even neutral or positive actions through a lens of negativity, accumulated from months or years of feeling unseen. A partner smiles, and the other partner thinks, what is that smile about? A partner offers to help, and the other partner thinks, what do they want? Once negative sentiment override has set in, the actual behavior of the partner becomes almost irrelevant. The interpretation machine has been broken, and every signal comes through damaged. Gottman found this state to be one of the most reliable predictors of marital dissolution, more predictive in some cases than the frequency of conflict itself. You can fight constantly and recover from it. You cannot easily recover from the state of having decided, somewhere below conscious awareness, that your partner is fundamentally against you. Teresa saw this same contamination happen in spiritual communities and in private souls. She described it as a kind of darkness that enters when the soul stops believing that God wishes it well, when the trust breaks, when the small signals of care that are always being offered go unrecognized because the receiver has decided, based on past hurt, that no real care is coming. And the terrible irony is that this state of distrust makes genuine care harder to give, because the giver becomes exhausted by the lack of reception and eventually gives less, which confirms the receiver's suspicion that no real care was ever on offer. Teresa said the only exit from this spiral is what she called an act of pure will in the face of the feeling. You decide to trust, not because the feeling of trust has arrived, but because you understand that the alternative is a closed and dying interior. Decide, move, stop waiting to feel it. She proved this was possible by doing it herself. Around 1554, when she was 40 years old, she stopped in front of a painted image of the wounded Christ in the corridors of the convent of the Incarnation, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to be genuinely present to the relationship she had been performing. She did not have a vision that day. She did not hear a voice. She simply stopped and felt the full weight of how far she had drifted, and she allowed that weight to land. She wept, and she wrote in her autobiography that from that moment, the trajectory began to change. Not that everything became easy immediately, not that the aridity ended overnight, but that she had made the decision in that corridor to return, to try again, to offer what she had, imperfect and distracted as it was, rather than continuing to wait until she had something more impressive to bring. She was 40 years old. The next 28 years of her life produced the book of her life, The Way of Perfection, The Interior Castle, the Book of the Foundations, 428 surviving letters, and 17 Reformed Carmelite convents across Spain. Not in spite of the drift, because of what the return from it taught her. The corridors of the Convent of the Incarnation in Avila, where all of this began, are still accessible to visitors today. The original 16th century stonework remains largely intact. The corridor near the chapel, approximately 14 meters long and less than 2 meters wide, is the one that historians associate most closely with Teresa's daily movement during the years she wrote her autobiography. A tile plaque near the entrance to the cloister notes that Teresa walked here for more than 2 decades. It does not note how many times she passed someone in that corridor and turned away. It does not note the specific Thursday or Friday when she stopped, but she stopped, and she turned toward, and everything that followed came from that turn. Gottman's Love Lab in Seattle, the University of Washington apartment where 130 couples spent a day in 1990 while cameras recorded every interaction, was closed as a dedicated research facility in 2016 after more than 2 decades of operation. The data it generated has been used in more than 200 published studies. The finding that changed the most lives is also the one that sounds the least dramatic. The couples who stayed together were the ones who paid attention to the small things, not the grand gestures, the small things. Teresa of Avila wrote that in 1577 and signed her name at the bottom of the manuscript. It was never really about prayer.